Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
Well, his novel, The Seers, set in London, the story of Hannah, an Eritrean refugee. Sulaiman Addonia joins me on the program to discuss it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So in the acknowledgments, you write that you were reading poetry to a pond in Brussels, and the word Hannah popped up in your mind. And I'm curious about the choice saying the word and not the character or the name Hannah. Why word Hannah?
Well, ultimately, I guess it's because I am overpowered by words. It's my life. I live with words, surrounded by words. It's what I think about things. And the first thing I think about when I am in nature is how I communicate to nature, to the trees. And ultimately that happens through words. So I think I can't really recollect why I have said that, but I think it's ultimately down to the fact that words actually mean everything to me.
So it meant everything to you, but it wasn't a very specific person or character that you envisioned immediately. You kind of had to figure out who Hannah was?
The thing about it is that I had, at the time I was working on a completely different book. It was going to be my first creative nonfiction. And so ultimately it's not something I really had planned, so I didn't go to the ponds that particular day in March 2020, the first lockdown, with the intention of writing. I was just taking my afternoon walk, and then I just stopped in that particular spot where I am often sitting, in happy or sad times, or, in significant moments in my life, most of the time reading poetry to the trees and, building that connection with the trees, with nature, with the water of the pond and so on. And then just Hannah came to me, it was just one single word. I had no idea who she was, what it was. I was just driven by that kind of power of the subconscious. And I was pulled straight away to this, I would say, alternative universe that belonged to Hannah. And I was just there. I was just gone.
So is the piece of you that's in Hannah this connection to nature, like her decision to live under a tree for a while?
The honest answer is I don't really know. And it doesn't have to be that, it doesn't have to be exactly how you've put it. I think maybe, I often think about it like maybe she was just on her way to somewhere and then she saw me in a particular, standing, looking at the pond, at the trees. Maybe she thought I'll just pause and tell my story. So I absolutely no idea. I just received her with open heart. And I think ultimately my writing practice is or has been to move from the conscious to the subconscious. So I am able to receive characters with open heart. My work has been about creating an imagination that looks like the freest country in the world, an imagination or space able to handle whoever decides to come. And ultimately I think I've succeeded. It's been, decades of work, with, being supported with avant-garde artists, surrealist artists, writers from all over the world that I really love and push me towards that point where I am able to say, okay, if it's someone like Hannah, yes, so be it. I'm able to surrender to her world and be guided by her.
What is your practice that allows you to move from the conscious to unconscious? And how did you discover that?
Well, that's a great question, actually. So I moved from London to Brussels in 2009 for love because I fell in love with a Belgian woman I met at university in London. So, she decided to come back after spending 8 years in London, and I decided to follow her. At that time, I came with the outline of what would be my second novel, The Silence is My Mother Tongue. And in it, there was a character called Jamal. And, Jamal is actually I would say, my most important character. And when I came to Brussels, I was writing him. And then I felt like I couldn't go to the places he wanted to take me. And I've decided to get rid of him because he was just, confronting me with things I didn't feel right. And then I've just left him aside, decided to kill him off as a character. But I had started to have sleepless nights. He started to come to me throughout the night. I just, I had insomnia and so on. And then I've decided I just can't get rid of him. And then the decision was, okay, how do you write characters like Jamal who are provocative? They've got specific sexual desires that I felt I couldn't write at the time. And I discovered that actually the fault lies with me, not with Jamal. I was conditioned, I was judgmental. So I've decided that if I were going to write three characters like Jamal, then I had to rewrite my imagination and get rid my imagination from taboos, basically. And then I've isolated myself with amazing but controversial artists like George Bataille, Anne Declo, read Henry Miller, Taib Saleh, Nawara Sadawi, international artists who were really provocative, who were all about going wherever their characters take them to without any judgmental. And so that was the beginning where I felt like, okay, here we go, let's do the work of rewriting my imagination, rewriting myself, deconstructing myself and derooting myself from society, its norms, its conditions, its ideals, its obsessions with subtlety, with this and that. And I just moved to this space that I felt like was ultimately where artists should be.
Is it that you felt you couldn't necessarily write a character who would live in a way that you wouldn't live, and kind of overcoming that was part of the battle?
Absolutely. It doesn't mean every character that comes to me has to be like me, and what I found out is that because I became a writer in London, I think a literary scene by and large that is obsessed with subtlety, I felt like then characters ultimately had to convey certain norms and behaviors. And that was when I moved to London and I isolated myself and I moved away from that world. It just felt like I entered a world where it was possible to write characters who don't make love like yourself, who don't look like you, who don't believe in the same way that you do. It was about actually creating an imagination that was the freest possible place so that characters could feel at home wherever they were, whatever they believed in, whatever their ideals of sexual identities were. Yeah.
It seems like maybe Hannah goes through a process similar in reading her mother's diaries.
Mm-hmm.
Was that intentional?
I don't know if it was intentional. Honestly, as I've just said a moment ago, to me, I think Hannah and the Seers have actually shown that, I have succeeded in moving from the conscious to the subconscious, which means moving away from plotting, moving away from actually describing what each character's motivations are, what they need, how they're going to go. It was just, I absolutely had no idea. When I stood in front of that pond that day in March 2020, I had no idea who Hannah was, her friends, her sexual desires and needs and what she wanted to do. So I just followed her. I consciously, I can't really figure out, I can't answer any question about why she did that. What was it intentional? I don't know. I just followed her. And then the diary came, her father came, her mother came, Roisin came, all the 100 poets who live in Tavistock Square came. So ultimately, it was just about being guided by her in her world, and me being a vessel, if you like, for that universe that she kind of embedded.
If you're acting as a conduit for her story, then what is the editing process like, and how do you kind of go about refining things or narrowing things down, or is there an editing process?
Well, I think I have to say it was a bit challenging because, the book took about 3 weeks to write on my iPhone. It was, I didn't really plan it to be a 1-paragraph novel, and it came out like that. I have no idea why. It was just like, boom, it's kind of like I was zigzagging through paragraphs, scene to scene, city to city, country to country, continent to continent with Hannah. And then in the edit, and I think it was challenging to sell the book because of that. So it took about 4 years. But I would say, obviously, the challenging bit was about how do you keep it as it was, not kind of mess around with certain elements that were kind of very important to the book, to the narration, to the, which I felt was a gift to my imagination. And that's what I did. I've just stayed true to the form. Of course, they were kind of like, the way I describe it is like a baby is born, and it's all, when born with blood and stuff, and then it's all about cleaning it, and then the baby is there. The physical entity of this book has not changed at all. What changed are just kind of like cleaning those kind of maybe sentences here and there.
So the editing process is like washing the afterbirth off.
Yeah, absolutely. It was minimal. It wasn't, it was just about, structure. It was solid. Nothing has changed. Hannah and her friends were the same. It was just about refining sentences here and there. And also, like, for me, the challenge was how to, in that editorial, when I was editing, the challenge was really how do I go back to the subconscious? And ultimately, I have developed tricks, where I could really go to that place and be truthful and embody the spirit of Hannah and the playfulness and that kind of the power she and her mate have in terms of embracing their freedom.
Was it a one-paragraph novel because you were writing it on your iPhone, or because Hannah kind of essentially dictated it that way, or a little of both?
I have no idea. I mean, it's if you write it on your iPhone, I mean, ultimately, I think I keep saying ultimately because I have no other way to kind of like describe to my answer to you in certain instances. I think I would say probably most likely I was inspired by my walks in Brussels because, I love walking. It's always been my way since I was a child to process things. And, I love architecture because of that. And Brussels is the perfect place if you are really interested in architecture. And there is that street close to where I live, which is like, 2 minutes away from that pond where I wrote the novel. And in that street, there are various architectural style, Art Nouveau, Brutalism, modernist buildings. And I just always felt fascinated by how that street can handle all this variation of architectural style and yet look amazing, look beautiful in its diversity. And I felt like if that street can handle such weighty ideas, so kind of novel, and I think maybe I look back and I think maybe I was inspired by that particular street in throwing different forms and ideas in one block, so that's why the Seers was just one block. It came in one block.
Speaking of being inspired, you mentioned in the acknowledgement that you see this as in dialogue with books you've read and loved, including stuff by Roberto Bolaño and others that you already mentioned. Do you step away from reading when you're writing, or are you reading as concurrent with writing, and do you find that things kind of seep in as a result of that?
No, I really step away from reading when I am in it, when I'm in a zone. I think I always say like my work as a writer actually mostly comes before I start the writing, I always say that my power as a writer has been how to arrive at my desk naked from ideas, identities, religion, fascination with this and that, obsession with this and that. But at the same time, my imagination fully empowered, having done the work in terms of reading, exploring ideas. I don't just read books. I genuinely think the street is a library and people are books. So, that's why I'm always out on the street, sitting in cafes, in markets. I buy a coffee and I sit in a market and I shop traits, as people shop around. I love this idea of going to a museum and just sitting in front of one painting and reading one particular painting and building a relationship with the details of that particular painting, as opposed to going from room to room. So all this work that I do them before I sit at my desk or in nature, as I did with the Seers, so that when I write, I'm just in that zone. Nothing really disturbed that process. No ideas filters. No other kind of like significant new ideas would clash with my imagination at the time of creating.
So the pre-writing process is kind of one of absorption and drawing in as much as you can before you actually kind of create something from a blank page?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, I think for me, it took me a long time to realize actually as a writer, what you do before the writing is the most important thing. Because like with my second novel, for example, Silence is My Mother Tongue, I was reading a lot of feminist novels, painters, and things like that. And I think that really was important to that particular book, which kind of looked at feminism in the African context. So yeah, it's just about really going deep in all these ideas, be it contemporary ideas or from the avant-garde times and so on, which I'm obsessed with. So yeah, the more I feed my imagination with, the more I read, the more I watch films and things like that, the more I feel capable of handling variety of characters when they decide to come to my imagination.
Kulu yahalef fikri yaterif. It's an Eritrean proverb that repeats throughout the Seers. Was this
Yes,
something that you
absolutely.
knew before this book?
Yes, it's something that I knew before this book, and to be honest, I've never thought it would appear in any of my work. I was always fascinated by it. I found it really beautiful, but the way it appeared in the book, it caught me by surprise because it was the repetition of it on rereading. I felt really emotional on seeing it again and again, but I mostly my emotion was tied to the idea that initially it appears in three in English and in Tigrinya, and then slowly as Hannah spends more time in England, the Tigrinya bit starts to fade away, and that really I found that quite emotional. I have to say, to the point that Hannah completely lost the Eritreans part of the saying, and the English was the last thing that remained, and I don't understand. I couldn't understand why that happened, and I obviously felt it has to do with distance, but also sometimes the language from homes can be quite wounding because they carry so much memories that sometimes we like maybe to distance ourselves from because they're quite painful memories.
It translates to everything passes, love remains. And it seems like a process of shedding or forgetting other than the kernel of, love. And it seems like maybe that's the key to Hannah in terms of her identity and her process, right? That like her journey rather than her process, that she has to hold on to something, but she has to let go of a lot of things in order to survive.
Absolutely, but I would also say in order to thrive. And I think that's why I ultimately feel this novel is a playful novel because Hannah is highly experimental. She and her African lovers, talking about being a bee here, they are playful, and I think it's about how do you maintain your core as a human being, your humanity and dignity. And I think that their obsession with sexuality, with sex, becomes a way, almost like a torch, it's guiding them through dark tunnels, through dark days, dark years of being in a place that decided didn't want them, or immediately anyway. And so it's a playful novel in that sense that they try to explore their identity despite or in spite of carrying all the burdens they have, even though they're young. And that free spirit really is something I find moving. And I find we don't talk a lot about people on the move, people in displacement. That isn't just about surviving, it's also about thriving, it's also about having fun, it's also about exposing yourself to different ideas, having that power and potential to be home for variation of desires, and keeping to redefine what sex and love and ultimately life means to you.
So the love in Love Remains isn't just care, but also the sex act that can remain.
Absolutely. It's also about having the audacity to say to yourself, right, I am going through difficult moments. I'm here coming to the UK. I'm talking about Hannah and Bina B, her lover, asking for an asylum, yet the decision hasn't come through. So they really are caught in that no man's land. And And so it's about in that place, in that space where they are cast aside, where they have much time because they're not allowed to study, they're not allowed to work, they're not allowed to be part of the UK citizenship, and so in that part of the in that particular space, they develop a language, and that language is dictated by the movement of their bodies. They come to do this kind of interior journey, to take an inward journey, because they have time, and time which is meant to kind of dehumanize them in a way, ultimately becomes their power, their plane to transport themselves to a different reality. And so illusion also plays a part in the novel, and sex becomes this vehicle to a space and a place where they could see themselves full of humanity, full of dignity, full of resourcefulness, full of joy and happiness at the same time as going through the difficult phase in their lives.
That place that they're in, put there by the British government, and kind of the way that the refugee system works. I was curious about kind of the descriptions where, when Hannah's telling her story and how she ends up there and appealing for asylum, that she's told by the lawyers, yeah, you got to actually doctor this, because the truth isn't necessarily, as terrible as the truth is, it's not necessarily going to get you where you need to be. How conscious of that process or things were you when you were writing this, if this was kind of Hannah's story that you were processing, or was that something that entered things because of your own experiences, or like how did that kind of angle come about?
I don't remember how the angle came about, but what I would say is that ultimately I always feel like, and this is like a playful relationship between myself and my characters, sometimes I feel because they come to my imagination, perhaps they steal some of my ideas. And I feel like there's always that playful exchange that happens at the subconscious level. I've went through something similar to Hannah, but it wasn't exactly as Hannah went through. Because ultimately, the system, the way it treats, it tried to lump everyone together, because the system is one, it's almost like one identity, one definition of how it exists. It doesn't differentiate between somebody coming from here to there, or at the time anyway. Then I feel like perhaps that was the only way through which Hannah can navigate her asylum story as well as being a bee. And so it felt like, yeah, there are definitely going to be similarities, because there were no other ways through which asylum happened in the UK. It's the only way that I knew of, and I think it's the only way that existed at the time. And I always feel this like playful relationship with Hannah, that she and I perhaps were maybe, came to the UK around the same time, and we went through the same time, but she went in a different way than I did.
Speaking of the time, was this meant to be set in the early 90s?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, because the description of Top of the Pops and Maxi Priest close to you being on the radio, I was like, is that supposed to be when it's airing? Is that when this is placed?
Oh, amazing. I think he's the only, I've been talking about this book for a year now. He's the only person so far who mentioned that to me. And when on rereading, I felt, yeah, that's the time. David Bowie and all those kind of amazing artists that inspired Hannah, yeah.
Oh, I loved that song growing up, and so I was very fascinated because the lyrics, I was like, oh, I know which song he's talking about, and then I'm like, okay, when did this come out? And I'm like, okay, I guess this is meant to be kind of concurrent with that. And so placing it in that time period, I think that was maybe kind of the second wave of like diasporic artists becoming huge hits in the UK.
Really?
It feels like, because there was like, the previous kind of like reggae, but then like 1990s, I would say like after ska and punk, you saw kind of the more like R&B lovers rock.
Uh-huh. I don't know. Because when I came to the UK, I just felt like Pop of the Pop was the most amazing thing. I would sit down and watch it all the time in a way Hannah does. And I think because both of us were caught in the same space of time, in a sense that we had nothing else to do but to wait. And while you wait, you're kind of because you're not allowed to be part of the British society because you don't speak the language. Well, you're not allowed to go to school. In my case, I think I went to school a bit faster than Hannah did. But there is time where you're waiting, and when you're waiting, You're trying to kind of learn about the country you're in, and and belonging happens through different ways. While they ask you to wait because you're not allowed to belong until we decide whether your case has been accepted. But when you're watching TV, when you're watching artists singing, and you see their freedom, they become part of you, and you're belonging already to the society through them. So art becomes really your passport into that society before the decision of the Home Office comes through. It's irrelevant. It's only relevant because it makes your life easier to go to school or to get a job and so on. But in terms of like being part of the British society that has adamantly decided it can't be part of us until we decide, then the art becomes, the top of the pop was the back door to belong to the British society, despite being told you're not ready yet.
That may be my own prism as an outsider not living in England to see it as the kind of second wave, but I digress.
Yeah.
You dedicate this book to London, and in the book, Hannah writes about, the city is suitable for her melancholia, but the London that her aunt had described was ecstatic. Is that kind of that push-pull between the two, kind of how you saw London?
Yeah, I mean, for me, London started to make more sense to me when a few months after I came to London, we were living in an area called Peckham, which is like South London. And then my brother, who was my guardian at the time because I was underage, he said that we should move outside London and be closer to the English. And we thought like Croydon, which is like zone 6, I think, the suburb of London, we thought it was the heartland of English. So the idea was to improve our English quickly. So we kind of like, we go through, we kind of educate ourselves quickly. And that was why we were sent to the UK. Education was part of it. Yes, we escape so many other things, but, learning English was ultimately the most important thing for us. So we decided to go to Croydon, and in Croydon, away from our community in the center Eritrean community. In Croydon, it was really difficult to befriend English, so we felt isolated and away from our community, and not being seen by the English community in Croydon. And those days I was walking, I've decided to walk a lot, and as I was walking, I've started to build a different relationship with London to the one I previously had when I was in London itself, in central London. And, it's the buildings started to become, almost speak a silent language, but it was a language to me. I felt like welcomed by the buildings, and the facades started to have almost human-like entity and qualities about them. So I felt like the street, the trees, the buildings, everything came together to have a story that I was being told. And I'm, in those dark, lonely days, I felt seen by the street. And that was the relationship that I had with London started then in Croydon, on the suburb of London, on the outskirts of London. It was a relationship that I felt it was almost like being seen and being welcomed, and so there was a lot of sentimentality about it, and I carried that with me when I moved back to central London, and it became part of my relationship with London, especially when it rains. I'm always out on the street when it rains. I can't explain it. I can't describe it in the way Hannah does, but to me, it felt like I came alive because when I was on the street, because the streets were the first thing that I felt welcomed by in the UK.
You were seen by the streets. The book is The Seers. It's out through Assembly Press. Sulaiman, thanks very much for joining me on the program and discussing the book.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.